In this video, we'll go over the practice test on network policies. So how many network policies do you see in the environment? So we've deployed a few web applications, services, and network policies to inspect the environment. So let's take a look. Seems to be an image, so we do not have the alias set. Set the alias. Okay, let's first check out the pod. So we have 4 pods. So you have the external, internal, and the MySQL and payroll pod. So you have the external, you have the internal pod, you have the payroll pod, and the DB pod, which is the MySQL pod. And let's check out the services. You have the DB service, the external service, internal service, and the Kubernetes service. So these are, the payroll service. So these are the services. So each of them are on different ports. So you have 8080 for the payroll service. The external and internal service are both on 8080. Then you have the DB service, which is on 3306. These are the port numbers. And the question is to identify the network policies in the environment. So we could do a get, we've got to get network policies. So you have the payroll policy. You could also do you've got to get net pol. So that's the short form for network policies. So we'll stick to this going forward. So there is one policy, and that's called as the payroll policy. So there's one policy in total. So what is the name of the network policy? That is payroll policy. Okay, so which pod is the network policy applied on? So if you look at this, you have a pod selector, and it says name equals payroll. So the name of the pod is payroll, and so the pod name is payroll. So the network policy named payroll policy is applied on the pod, which is called as payroll. So that's this pod. So if you look at the image, we have now identified that this is kind of how it looks. So you have the external pod, internal pod, DB pod, and then you have the payroll pod, and the network policy is applied on the payroll pod. Now, as we learned from the lectures, by default, all pods allow traffic, both ingress and egress, on all the ports. So there are no restrictions. But as soon as you apply a network policy, it's kind of blocked. So everything gets blocked. And then you have to manually allow stuff. So let's try and answer this question. So what type of traffic is the network policy configured to handle? So let's look at the network policy in more detail. So let's do a kubectl describe netpol payroll policy. And we see the pod selector, which we know, and it's allowing ingress traffic to port 8080 from the pod. And it says not affecting egress traffic. So there are no rules for egress traffic. That means all egress traffic from this pod to external to outside world is not allowed. And the only thing that's allowed is ingress traffic. So what type of traffic is the network policy configured to handle? It's just ingress. Okay, now what is the impact of the rule configured on this network policy? So looking at this, we know that it allows ingress traffic to port 8080. So this is with the to the port within the pod. From we have a pod selector, and the name is internal. So this rule allows ingress traffic to port 8080 on the payroll pod from the internal pod. So this is basically what is allowed. So traffic to and from payroll pod is blocked. Not entirely true, because we know that there is one route of traffic that is allowed. Traffic from internal to payroll pod is blocked. Traffic to and from the internal pod is blocked. Traffic from internal to payroll pod is allowed. So traffic from internal to payroll pod is allowed. So that's the correct answer. Now, what is the impact of the rule configured on this network policy? So in other words, external pod can ping payroll pod. So external pod can ping payroll pod. That's not correct. External pod can't do anything. The internal pod can ping payroll pod. The internal pod cannot ping the payroll pod because we have not, we have only allowed TCP, the TCP rule. So that's not going to be allowed. External pod can access port 8080. That's not true because we have not configured anything for the external pod. The internal pod can access port 8080 on payroll pod. So that's allowed. So that's the correct answer. Now access the UI of these applications using the link given above the terminal. Okay, so if you look at this, you have the external portal and the internal portal. So let's open those up. Okay, so this is the internal facing application, the one, the blue background, and this is the external facing application. Okay, so access the UI of these applications using the link below. That's we've just done that. Now perform a connectivity test using the user interface in these applications to access the payroll service at port 8080. So we're going to try and see, we've said this in your policy, but we're just going to see it for real. So from the external port and the internal port, we're going to we're going to try and access this payroll pod on port 8080. So the service to access the payroll pod is the payroll service. So we're going to copy this, and from the internal facing application, we're going to try to do a test, and that is successful. From the external facing application, we're going to do a test, and that's timed out. So this is working as expected. The answer here is both internal and external applications can access payroll. No, so that's not correct. Only internal application can access the payroll service. Okay, now perform a connectivity test using the user interface on the terminal application to access the external service at port 80. So we want to see if, so we have identified that this is how it is. Internal pod can access a payroll pod and external pod cannot access a payroll pod. Now let's see if the internal pod can access the external pod. So external service at port 8080. This is the internal application. I'm going to try and access the external application at port 8080. And that is success. So that is allowed. So let's select successful. Now finally, we have to create a network policy to allow traffic from the internal application only to the payroll service and DB service. So this is the internal application. We want to block its access to everything else except for the payroll service and the database service, right? So this is what we want to achieve. So basically this is what we want to create. Use the spec given below. So we have to create a network policy named internal policy, and that is this. And we have to, so after creating the policy, we need to associate it with the internal pod. So that's the pod specification, like the pod selector should be for the internal pod. And then the policy is egress. So we're going to configure egress traffic. So we're going to block everything except for the egress traffic to both of these. And then there should be two rules. One is to the payroll pod, and the other is to the DB pod, which is the MySQL pod as shown here. So let's try and do that. So first, let's go to the Kubernetes documentation pages and look for network policies. And let's get a template to start with. So we're going to get one till here. So let's create a file called internal policy.yaml. Okay, so the policy name. So the policy name has to be internal policy. Then you have the pod selector. So we basically want to select this pod. So that's going to be okay. And let's specify a name, internal. Okay, and let's pick the egress rule. So we only want egress rule. Let's have that here. So we want to have, let's first define what we want. So first we need one rule for this and another rule for this. So we basically need two rules. Let's add that here. And so the first rule is, so we need to specify the pod selector. So pod selector and match labels. So we want to allow egress traffic to the pod p-roll. So we're going to give it a name, p-roll, and we also want to specify ports. So we want to allow protocol TCP to port. So to p-roll, it's 8080. Okay. So that's the first rule. Same way, we're going to have for the second rule, we need to specify to which pod as well as to which port, right? So let's just check it here. So it should be, so each one will have a to and ports. So it's actually ports. I'm gonna fix that. Okay. And within this, we're going to have pod selector. And then we're going to have match labels. And then we have MySQL. So that's the second pod. And then we're going to have ports. Then we specify the protocol, which happens to be TCP. And the port for MySQL is 3306, as you can see here. Okay, so this particular policy, so we're going to remove ingress from here. So what this does is it creates a policy for the internal, it creates an internal policy for the internal pod using this label. So everything has a label with the name on it. And then we're allowing egress to the payroll pod on port 8080. And then on the MySQL pod on port 3306. Now let's create that policy. Okay, let's do a describe internal policy, and we'll verify the pod selector and egress traffic configuration. So we have 8080 to payroll and 3306 to MySQL, and it's configured. You'll have egress policies configured. Let's check it out. Okay, so that's about it, and that's the end of this lab.